This year we've got 2 canola variety by management trials situated at Inverleigh and Lake Bolac. At Inverleigh we've got 2 varieties, 2 times of sowing and 2 different methods of nitrogen calculation as our factors. And at Lake Bolac we've got 6 varieties, the same 2 nitrogen calculation methods, and half of our treatments have a PGR. So John, would you like to tell us a bit about our factors at Inverleigh?
I would indeed. So the Inverleigh trial has 3 management factors. We're looking at varieties, we're looking at the influence of time of sowing and how that can be manipulated to optimize the start of flowering. And then the 3rd factor is looking at the nitrogen management, and Grace will go into more details on that. So just to start off with on varieties, just to sort of set the scene. So at Inverleigh, the spring varieties we have are Ignite from Seed Force and ATL Wahoo, which is an OP variety. So we've got hybrid versus OP. Both varieties have been specifically chosen to be mid-maturity, so that if we sow them on the same day, ideally they should develop at the same kind of rate. They do have slightly different blackleg resistant ratings, and we saw last year in the variety management trials some slight differences between the 2 varieties. I guess this next bit of data is just something I went back and looked at the Southwest Vic MBT sites over the last 4 years, and this is really showing that we should expect to see Ignite yield higher than Wahoo. We picked Wahoo because it's sort of seen to be a control variety as an OP, and Ignite's pretty popular, but as you can see over the last 4 years, every year, and this is an average of 3 sites per season across the Southwest Vic NBT sites, it's yielded higher. So there's an expectation that when we set off right from the get-go, we're likely to have slightly higher yields out of the Ignite. So that's the first factor. The second factor is what can we do to influence the start of flowering, because that's a real key component in terms of building yield. And one of the things we are able to do to optimize that start of flowering is the time of sowing. And obviously this year, the time of sowing was closely followed by everything emerging. That's not always the case, and sometimes people get a bit hung up about this is when I sowed it, but it's actually really when it comes up that's the important thing. The variety maturity is clearly going to influence the time and the phenology that the crop takes to get to that flowering time through its maturity, and then the environment that you actually grow the crop in. So whether we're growing it at Inverleigh can change if we're growing it at Hamilton, and other environments clearly change that whole set of circumstances. So optimal start of flowering, or OSF, is really what we should be aiming for to get that start of flowering for optimizing the highest yield possible for any given location. And we'll know from a lot of the work, those of you who were around when we had James Hunt down at Westmere talking about time of sowing with wheat, which is actually now very much a standard process, that flowering too early, there's a risk of frost, and if you're flowering too late, obviously then you move into heat stress, and potentially not this year, but actually an increase of water stress. And so the following graph just shows you something that you probably would have seen previously. This is the optimum start of flowering data for Hamilton, and this is just showing that this box here covers the times where it's deemed to be the appropriate time to start the flowering of a crop. And then we can see that when we get into the middle of this range, we're optimizing the yield. This yield here showing that this could potentially be limited by heat or frost. The one above it, not limited, so there's a bit of an upside there. And then I guess it's where we're getting this crossover between the frost risk diminishing and the heat stress and water stress rising. So that's quite an important date. I don't know how many growers, when they're actually looking at their sowing program, are actually trying to target a specific date in terms of when the crop's going to flower, rather than saying, well, you know, I used to sow my canola early in May and I now sow it a week or two earlier. There's probably a little bit more science can be put behind that. And that science comes from the following calculator, which we actually used as part of this project to try and determine with the mid-maturity varieties that we had at Inverleigh, what would be the most appropriate time to sow those varieties to optimize the start of flowering time. And secondly, could we, if we sowed them a little bit later and push that flowering window more to its extreme, what did that actually mean in terms of the final yield? So if all this works, hopefully I can go to the flowering calculator. So this is what it looks like. Hopefully everyone can see that. So you have two boxes: what variety should I sow and when should I sow it? Well, we know what varieties we're sowing already. We're going to sow Ignite and Wahoo in this case. So when should I sow it? Click on the box.
We can't see the calculator.
You can't see the calculator.
Might need to swap the screens that you're showing.
I've only got it on one screen.
Might have to close your PowerPoint, like minimize your PowerPoint and go into the web.
This is all very challenging. Okay. Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm just going to talk through what you do. Unfortunately, you're not going to be able to see it, but that's fine. So when you get into the flowering calculator and you decided on the variety that you want to sow, you get a drop-down list that shows you a range of varieties that are typical for the varieties that are available to us, and they go from the very long season length varieties, Hyola 971, down to varieties like Diamond. So we just look through that list and we pick a mid-maturity variety, which in this case we're picking Hyola 559 as the nearest equivalent to Ignite and to Wahoo. Then we're able to click on, we select the environment, because clearly that's going to have an influence around what the environment that the crop's going to be growing in. We have an option for the Western District of Inverleigh or Hamilton. And if we click on Inverleigh, then we get what you all need to go and look at when in due course, is that you'll see for a mid-maturity variety that the optimal sowing date is the 19th of April. That means we have an average start of flowering date, target date, for about the 8th of August. And then we can look down the list and we can say, okay, well, if we don't sow on the 19th, what happens if we sow later? What happens to the sowing date? So I can tell you that we actually sowed on the 20th of April, and we got our start of flowering on the 11th of August rather than the 8th of August. So we're pretty much in line with what the model said. We then deliberately sowed 2 weeks later, which was the 6th of May. The model shows that the flowering date for that start of flowering should be about the 26th of August, and we landed on the 23rd of August. So the model's pretty accurate for that environment. And what we're going to do is take those varieties through and then see where we get to in terms of what impact that might have on yield, which is ultimately the whole point of what we're looking to try and achieve. So that's the flowering calculator. Now I just need to get back to the presentation. So sorry about that, everyone. I had a great time. Sorry you couldn't see it, but anyway, can everyone see my screen again now?
Yep.
So there's the website, www.canolaflowering.com.au. It's a CSIRO-run site. There's 60 years worth of data. I think it's a really good tool to give you a guide as to where you ought to be once you pick your variety, where you think you need to be from a sowing point of view. So I'll now hand over to Grace, who will probably be doing a lot of nodding and winking at me because I'm the one who's controlling the slides moving forward here, but she's just going to touch on the nitrogen management, the strategy we've taken with the standard method.
So our standard method and calculation, which we've used in previous years of variety by management trials as well, is 80 kilograms of N per tonne of yield targeted, minus the N already present in the soil and mineralised. So this year for Inverleigh, our TOS1 is targeting 4 tonnes per hectare in yield, while our TOS2 is targeting 3.5 tonnes per hectare. On the next slide, you'll see a graph comparing our urea applications between our GAI and standard rates. I'll go into more detail about the GAI method looking at Lake Bolac, but for now, just have a look at these graphs and we can come back to them at the end if people want to have another look. Moving on to Lake Bolac.
Okay, so I'll pick it up again, Grace. Happy with that?
Yes.
Just for anybody who we're all just saying GAI. GAI stands for Green Area Index, just so that everyone understands what that means. And Grace will use the data from Lake Bolac to explain that in a bit more detail. So at Lake Bolac, when we look at the 3 factors, we picked variety. Because all the varieties are winter canola, we haven't gone with a time of sowing. We've gone with a nitrogen management strategy based on Green Area Index, the app on the phone versus a standard approach. And then the third factor is looking at PGRs, which SFS is often asked about. I'm not sure we always get the right result, but I think there's many reasons to keep doing some work in that particular area on canola. So if we just quickly have a look and start on the varieties, as Grace said earlier on, the 6 varieties, and they're all winter types. Some of those would be varieties that certainly the top 3 would be varieties that people would be familiar with. The other varieties, I'm not sure how far away they are from coming to the marketplace. I'm sure Craig will be able to tell us about the AGF line a bit later. And the variety, I don't know if it's pronounced Niza or Niza or neither. That's actually a variety that is currently available in the UK and is one of the Clearfield varieties have only been available there for a reasonably short time. So that's a variety that is yielding really well over in Europe at the moment. So they're the varieties. And just out of interest, and I won't try and get back to that tool again, but these are the flowering dates along this edge here of the different winter canolas. The varieties were all sown on the 9th of April, and in fact, if you look on the flowering calculator tool, it talks about ideally to hit your perfect flowering window, you should be sowing these on about the 20th of February. So there's a big potential flowering window. So are we too late by putting winters in at Lake Bolac on the 9th of April? Well, this overlay that comes over the top now is the optimum start of flowering window. So you can see that we're just inside it and just slightly outside it, potentially Hyla 970 is the furthest outside. So again, there's a trial within a trial almost, because we're going to be able to see whether that later timing, which sort of starts tying in with potentially heat stress and moisture stress, whether we are too late there putting those in on the 9th of April. So now I'll let Grace fully explain the nitrogen practice that we've done, including the Green Area Index tool.
Thanks, John. So this year we're using the Green Area Index tool from BASF. It's a favoured calculation method in the UK to give a more structured approach to nitrogen application. You can use it either through the iPhone app, which is very simple to use. You can take a photo out in the paddock, enter it into the app, upload the details when prompted, and it'll spit out a result almost instantly. As it's a UK-based tool, it unfortunately doesn't have Australian locations, which means that this year we have completely inundated Aberdeen to get our results. If you'd prefer to work on your computer, on the next slide, you'll see the online entry portal. Again, just enter your details and it'll spit out your processed image and GAI. The benefit for working online is you can take all your photos and analyze them later, and you get that original image and the process image side by side. So this image here is for a crop canopy of GAI of 3. So the next thing you've got to do is calculate your results. So you start with your soil test results between 0 to 60 centimetres. For Lake Bolac this year, we had 52 kilograms of N per hectare, and for mid-June, we had an average GAI of 0.79. Excuse me. The crop nitrogen content for GAI is worked out at 50 kilograms of N per hectare for each individual GAI unit. For 0.79, that gives us 40 kilograms of N per hectare. Add them together, and that's your current soil N supply in soil and in canopy. For our target N, we're aiming at 4 GAI at mid-flowering. To get that for the GAI, you use 3.5 GAI at early flowering at 50 kilos per hectare. The further 0.5 of a kilo of hectare then changes in the calculations to be an extra 30 kilos of N. So bringing that down to the bottom, we work out that for our target of 4 tonnes per hectare of N, we need 119 kilograms, and that for urea is 260 kilos. In comparison with our standard rate, it was calculated out to be 475 kilos of urea per hectare needed. So you'll see that in the next slide, where we see the comparison between the two application rates. For the difference between these rates has been worked out to be approximately $125 variable cost difference, simply in the added cost of the urea in the standard treatment, as well as application costs and freight. So in the next slide, we've been taking GAI photographs of each plot every second week so that we can track our canopy development. And as the graph shows, there was a distinct difference in canopy development throughout vegetation, but by the end of vegetation coming into start of flowering, the GAI had started to catch up, and we said we were aiming for that 3.5 at start of flowering, and we've managed to hit that fairly well. Into the next one, once you hit that 3.5 GAI, you start to get stem elongation, and the GAI visual tool doesn't work quite as well, simply due to the nature of taking the photos of the green area. So we start working in biomass. Our start of flowering biomass has given us 5.9 tonnes per hectare for the GAI treatments and 6.7 tonnes per hectare for the standard. So there's a bit of a split there, and it's continuing into the mid-flowering tonnage. But a biomass cut at harvest will complete this data set, and we'll be able to look more closely at how that worked out, as well as the yield component, obviously giving us a clearer idea of how the difference in nitrogen's been affected.
Okay. Well done, Grace. That takes a bit of wading through all that stuff. I think, let's see, I might just go back to this previous one if I can. So I think one of the things that that'll be interesting will be to ultimately find out where we end up on yield. We've clearly spent more on nitrogen, and you can see from those mid-flowering biomass cuts there's considerable difference in the tonnage. Now, I know that if I'm out in the paddock and I'm looking at those trials, which I did last week, at the moment I prefer the look of the one that's had more nitrogen because it looks thicker and slightly greener, and maybe it will ultimately yield more. But I guess part of what we're trying to do with using this green area index tool is that there's a big move at the moment to people putting more and more nitrogen on canola, and probably going earlier and earlier. And people are building biomass because they believe that that leads to greater yields. It does to a certain extent, but there's a big caveat that I'm not sure that I think we should quantify the biomass that people are building and know what you're building and when you're building it. And if I move on to the next part, one of the areas that happens when you do build biomass too early, which comes from typically now everybody's sowing earlier. People now realize that canola is a pretty nitrogen hungry crop. And so people are tending to put higher rates on to get better yields. But probably the biggest change along with the earlier sowing is that people are putting nitrogen on a lot earlier. There's a lot of nitrogen goes on at sowing. Now there's a number of reasons, and you know, one of the things, if you're going to have a wet winter, you're probably glad that your crop's got some nitrogen under it. But one of the things that all these things are doing is they're building big canopy size, and there are some rules of thumb which we've been basing which the green area index tool works around, and that is that we're trying to get at least 5 tonne a hectare in the crop as biomass by the time we get to early flowering. And we got higher than that, but the levels are continuing to go up significantly. So it'll be interesting to see where we end up on yield. But in terms of fungicides as PGRs, one of the things that we are creating when we're putting all this early nitrogen on is very tall crops. We're getting lodging. And there's also a lot of evidence to show that the significant amount of photosynthesis and pod filling comes out of radiation of sunlight getting into the crop. And the thicker the crop, the more reflectance you have of that canopy sunlight getting into the crop. And if you can't get sunlight down to those pods, they're just not going to fill. And ultimately, the yield of a canola crop is down to the number of seeds per square metre that you actually have. That equals pods per square metre and number of pods, obviously, but and seeds per pod. But if you can't fill all the seeds in the pod, then you're not going to get a decent yield. So what we're trying to do with this trial is to try and bring a little bit of science into the sowing date, so that we understand that we're optimizing that flowering period for the best chance of getting the yield. But secondly, trying to put some kind of quantitative measure into what that canopy looks like as we go through the season. So that's where the PGRs come in. The bad news is that unfortunately BASF and Syngenta that have products in the marketplace in Europe aren't prepared to bring those over to Australia at the moment. There is a product that you'd all be familiar with called Amistar Extra, which is now being superseded with these other PGRs in Europe for canola, but Amistar Extra at the highest label rate, which we can actually get away with in Victoria through off-label approval, applied at yellow bud. The triazole component of this chemical is extremely good as a growth regulant, similar to tebuconazole or follicule. So what this will do is it shortens the crop. It hopefully changes it if you can get it on at the right time and the conditions are suitable. It gives you a more open canopy, which is all part of getting that light interception down lower into the canopy and down onto those pods. Hopefully that leads to higher yield potential. And the other added benefit is these varieties haven't had any in-season foliar fungicide. So we're actually putting an Amistar strobial urine on it, early yellow bud, which may give us some kind of additional result. So with all that, Grace and I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to some questions.
As I said at the beginning, if you have a question, you can pop it either in the chat box or you can unmute your audio and video footage and ask your question direct to Grace and John. So while everyone's trying to get their thoughts in, do we know when we'll get benchmarks for the GIA in Australia? Are we going to, is there a project working on that?
Do you want me to answer that, Grace?
Sure.
No is a simple answer to that. So what we really need to do is we need to take that tool and it needs validating and calibrating. I think for Australia, my feeling is that one of the things, I think we can stand slightly thicker crops in Australia because I believe we have higher sunlight intensity than they do in Europe. But I think it's a great tool to be able to go out and use, use a phone app out in the paddock to get some kind of a measure, rather than at the moment it's gut feel and it makes you sleep easier at night knowing that you just put a load of urea out on your canola. But actually, are we wasting money putting too much out too early? And you know, the critical period for a canola crop is about 20 to 30 days after flowering. That's the key time where you can't afford to have anything holding the crop back. That might be heat, that might be frost, could be disease or nutrition. So we actually do need to be able to hold some nitrogen back so that in that mid-flowering period, the crop isn't short of nitrogen, and it shouldn't be, because it's still, as an indeterminate crop, it's still got a lot of work to do. So no, there isn't any work. Yes, I think there should be some, and we're certainly talking about it at Southern Panel with GRDC in terms of you know, the optimizing canola profitability project that previously existed, and a lot of people would know the work that Rowan Brill's done. That actually didn't include us in the Western District, Southern Victoria, which is crazy. So we need to make sure we're flying the flag for that next time round.
I have a question for Grace. When the urea went out, both applications were done at the same time for the two different treatments?
Yes, yes. Apart from the third application of urea on the standard treatments, the GAI didn't need it. It had hit its targets.
Can the GAI tool be used in other crop types as well, or is it only for canola?
Oilseeds is what it's advertised as, oilseed and rape crops. I
think it can be used for wheat. I think the reason it was developed in the UK for canola was purely because BASF sponsored it, because surprise, surprise, they had a PGR, and it suited them to try and encourage people to say your canopies are too thick, and now they're too thick, you better put our PGR on. So there was a commercial incentive behind it, but I think there is a wheat version of that.
That's it. Have you got a question, Gina?
I have two questions about the PGRs actually. John, do you know what the program that in Europe is used? What program in Europe is used for a PGR in canola, or is there more than one application, and what products do they use? The
two products that are currently being used, BASF have a product called Carix, and Syngenta have one called Toprex, and they're both getting used at the same time that we're using the Amistar Extra. So around that yellow to yellow bud, green bud timing. In terms of what's in them, they have a triazole component, because triazoles by their very nature have growth regulatory effect, but they also have other products in them as well, which are sort of more out and out growth regs. But I know people that have tried Modus on canola. One of the problems with putting a PGR on canola in terms of crop height is that the crop's growing so rapidly at that early stem extension stage is that you might get a short-lived effect in terms of crop height, but it grows through it. So I think that's why it's really important to get it on time, because you're looking for branching and opening the canopy up rather than actually necessarily shortening the crop. What was your second question? Hopefully that's for Grace, is it?
No, my second question was, when you're using a triazole as a PGR, how do you know that you're not causing a yield difference by controlling disease as well? Is there a way to control that, I suppose?
I don't know. It's a good question. Don't know. All I do know is that, and I made a comment about it in the canola report, in the spring results report that SFS put out, is that you shouldn't ever use a PGR type fungicide at the kind of levels you need to get a result, unless you've got a crop that's likely to lodge. If you've got a crop that's waterlogged and or struggling, short of nutrition, actually you can lose yield by putting a PGR fungicide out at those sort of high rates where you're going to pull the crop up.